again.
I'm Sophia.
My name is Daniela.
And why don't you tell us your major, Daniela?
Yes, I am a biology major, junior, and this is for our family violence class, and it is for our project.
Which is?
Specifically, ending the stigma with child sexual abuse. Treating the impacts of those experiences, especially to lower the age of disclosure. We really want to emphasize ending the stigma, especially because there's a lot of evidence out there that can help, to educate more people about, I guess, why there's a stigma to begin with and why it is wrong to have a stigma surrounding child sexual abuse.
Yes, it should not be more shameful to be a victim than it is to be a perpetrator of sexual abuse. And unfortunately, we currently live in a culture where it is more shameful to be a victim than it is to be a perpetrator of sexual abuse.
Yes.
So, we're going to start off by talking about ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. Danny, why don't you tell us a little bit about how ACEs relate to child sexual abuse?
Yes. As Sophie just mentioned, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And we actually watched a YouTube video on a TED Talk by Dr. Burke Harris in our class, and it was just the perfect video to talk about in our project. So Dr. Burke Harris in this TED Talk talks about the significance of childhood trauma, like abuse or neglect, and its impact on one's lifetime. Childhood trauma has been proven to dramatically increase the risk of affecting brain development, the immune system, among any other areas that can disrupt one's physiology. She even mentions that it can change the way your DNA reads and transcribes itself, which is just crazy to me, especially if you know anything about how that even works.
Miss Biology major over here.
She mentions actually that there is 3 times the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and there's also a 20-year life difference in life expectancy. So this actually began with a study with the CDC and Kaiser back a few years ago, and they studied 17,500 adults regarding their experiences and their history of adverse childhood experiences. And some of those adverse childhood experiences were physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. There were different categories. Another one was physical or emotional neglect. There was parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, and domestic violence. And for every check or experience that you have had as a child, you obtain a point. And at the end, you have a certain number of points that then correlate to ACE scores, and they'll also correlate to health problems. So in the study, they found that 67% of people that they studied had at least one ACE. And 12.6% of the individuals that participated in the study had 4 or more ACEs, which is where the statistics get very scary and very real. They found that of these 12.6% individuals that had 4 or more ACEs, the risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times more likely than that of someone with an ACE score of 0. The risk of hepatitis was also 2.5 times more likely than that of someone with an ACE score of 0. The risk of depression was 4 times more likely than that of someone with an ACE score of 0. And the risk for suicide was 12 times more likely than that of someone with an ACE score of 0. In short, the higher your ACE scores are, the worse your health outcomes could be. There is more risk for you developing diseases that could be life-threatening. So in this talk, Dr. Burke also explains how she has helped to implement and develop methods for preventing, treating, and healing children from the impacts of ACEs, and she does that through a multidisciplinary approach, and I think this is very important to implement, not
Yes.
only in children's. Obviously, like, for children, it would be vital because adverse childhood experiences, the name.
Obviously, children.
Yeah, right. But then they can help treat any problems that they might have at an early age, so there is less that can develop later in life and that can have more of an impact on them. I think that this should definitely be implemented in a bunch of health offices, doctors' offices,
Yes.
even Planned Parenthoods, and the list goes on. Personally, I think it's a public health problem. Like, since we
Yes.
know there's evidence, there are studies that show how much of an impact these adverse childhood experiences can have on you. Trauma is a really hard thing to carry, and like, I knew that before, but this class definitely helped, like, helped me sit with that more and think about that so much more than I thought about before. And again, it has so many ways that it can impact people, and it can impact people differently too. It's
Not a one size fits all.
Exactly. You have to look at it through a bunch of different, like, factors. You have to consider so many factors, and that's, I think, why it can also become so complex.
Yeah, I definitely think it's like a multifaceted issue. It definitely doesn't come in just one form.
Right.
And children also don't have the capacity to cope with trauma that adults do. They don't have the tools that adults have, and even
Right.
adults don't always have the best tools for coping with trauma, but children especially are so vulnerable, and, you know, their brains are in such a, like, what's the word? Such a
Vulnerable.
yes, their brains are in such a moldable phase of life. It's really important to, you know, get in there. I know that you suggested a screening,
Yeah.
like screening
absolutely.
for ACEs.
Yes.
In one of our, like, run-throughs of our script, you talked about a screening.
Yeah, I also, like, in going back to our entire, like, focus or of our project, treating the impacts of child sexual abuse to lower the age of disclosure, we learned that the average age, or the average time that it takes an individual that did suffer from child sexual abuse, the average time for them to disclose that happened to them is 21 years. And just knowing that, and knowing what position we are now in our lives, we are in college, we are between 18 and 22, 23 years old. That is, like, that correlates to that average of 21 years of disclosure. So going back to what Sophie was saying about how I think screening should definitely be implemented, it should definitely be implemented at a time, like, where we are susceptible to possibly disclosing that these experiences happen to us. And again, like, we know how much of an impact these experiences can have on you and your health. So
Yeah, if you had, like,
it's important.
if you had just begun to grapple with it now,
Yes.
it could help you. And we're going to get into this more later on about how traumas from your past can creep up in ways you wouldn't expect. We're going to
Yeah.
get into that a lot more later, but the point I'm trying to make is that if we had some type of screening for ACEs for college students, if they're dealing with some type of mental health issues and they're not sure exactly where that's coming from, or if they're wanting to look or unpack something that they might not even consider traumatic, something they may not even consider an adverse childhood experience, you know, a screening would be really helpful for those people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we're going to move on from the discussion of ACEs here. All right, now we're going to get into the New York State's definition of child sexual abuse. I just think it's important to include this because it is kind of like an overview for everything else we're going to be discussing. So we started off kind of tame with the ACEs, but now I want to give another trigger warning for specific instances and examples of child sexual abuse. If that's something that's going to trigger or be upsetting to you, I would not listen on. You're not missing anything, trust me. Like, you're fine if you want to click away. So, in New York State, child sexual abuse is defined as sexual abuse and maltreatment, including situation in which the parent, caregiver, or another person legally responsible for a child under 18 years of age commits or allows to be committed any one of the following acts: touching a child's mouth, genitals, buttocks, breast, or other intimate parts to gratify sexual desire, or forcing or encouraging the child to touch the caregiver or other person legally responsible in this way for the purpose of gratifying sexual desire. So first of all, I want to make a critique of this definition, which I mentioned earlier, that it doesn't have to be someone who is legally responsible for the child. It doesn't need to be a caregiver. It doesn't need to be a parent. It can be a teacher. It can be a religious authority figure. It can be a babysitter. I mean, would they be considered legally responsible if they were babysitting? I don't know.
I mean, like, I feel like as an adult,
Yeah.
like,
I mean,
yeah.
so that might fall under the definition, but basically, I don't want us to get lost in the legal jargon of this definition, and just because it says legally responsible, it doesn't mean you're not a victim of abuse just because it wasn't a parent or a caregiver. So then, this definition, like the one that's in New York State law, or like our law, like the code, it's actually broken down into 9 different sections. So I just read off the first 2, and then I want to touch on the final 2 parts, the final 2 sections of final 2 articles of the code, which are using a child in a sexual performance such as photograph, play, motion picture, or dance, and in addition giving indecent material to a child. So the reason I wanted to highlight those articles, those last 2 especially, is because there are some things that we wouldn't outwardly consider sexual abuse, not outwardly, but like overtly. But sexual abuse can take a lot of different forms, and part of the reason that we're making this podcast is to talk about the forms of child sexual abuse that are less common. We want to bring awareness to these, just so that people who are experiencing mental health struggles or problems don't feel that they aren't fitting into the right category of being abused, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We want everyone to be validated in their experience, and we don't want to like leave anything out. And I really think it's important to touch on giving indecent material to a child as a crime, because I think this can be very traumatic for children, and I think adults even don't really consider this as abuse. But indecent material could even be watching a movie with your child that isn't appropriate for them to be watching. It could just be like an R-rated movie or something like that. And it's not that you're like trying to purposefully abuse the child, but it's important to remember that children's brains are not wired the same way as adults. They don't have the tools, like I said earlier, to process all of these things, so we need to be really careful what we're exposing our children to if we want them to develop a healthy sexuality.
I feel like the most common example is like a father. I mean, it could be a mother too, giving their child like a porn magazine,
like a Playboy.
Yes, exactly. Where like there's explicit material, and again, children don't have the ability to process all that. Like,
Right.
What does that mean?
Why are you giving this to me?
Yeah, exactly.
What is the, you know what I'm saying? And it's almost like this cycle of perpetuating like toxic masculinity. It really plays
Yes.
into it, because the
Yes.
child is being taught, especially if it's a young male, they're being taught by their father, who they identify with, that this is like what men do. This is what men look at. This is what we consume. Like, this is the content we consume.
And
So
women
yeah,
as sexual objects.
yes, exactly,
As
and
sexual objects.
it sets up young boys to view women in that way, which is
Very
not healthy.
very degrading.
So yeah, that's just a quick definition of child sexual abuse, and that's for New York State. Obviously, it varies state to state, so I just wanted to give the definition that our state is governed by. I thought that would be helpful for our listeners. But moving on, we're going to be talking about case studies here. The reason we're going to be covering case studies is because, like I said, we want to draw attention to examples of sexual abuse that are more covert. I'm going to give one example to begin with that is a very overtly sexual abuse. It's pretty obvious. We're just going to talk about a very overt example of sexual abuse first, and then we're going to move into ones that are less overt, or ones that don't typically fit into your standard definition of what we think sexual abuse is. So our first case study is Alex, a 15-year-old, frequently babysat his 4-year-old neighbor Naomi. Each time Alex was left alone with Naomi, he had her stroke his exposed penis while they watched her favorite video. So, in this case study, the type of abuse we're looking at is a contact behavior. So, what constitutes sexual abuse can be broken down into two categories of contact and non-contact behaviors. So, obviously, anything where you're touching a child, that's going to be a contact behavior. But then I have two more cases after this that are considered non-contact behaviors. So the first of the non-contact is Dexter, age 30, invited 7-year-old Jimmy to his house frequently for afternoon snacks. After their snacks, Dexter asked Jimmy to undress and assume various sexual positions while Dexter videotaped him. Dexter sold the videos for profit. So this would be considered a non-contact form of abuse because Dexter didn't actually put his hands on Jimmy in any way or, personally abuse him, like through touching. But this is actually a subset of non-contact abuse, which is considered commercial exploitation. And this is all about selling images or videos of children, which it's a huge problem. Children are not meant to be sexualized. People should not be making money off of taking pictures of children. It's disgusting. It's very traumatic for the child, and it's just completely unfair to the child.
Very exploitive.
Yes.
The child is clearly vulnerable. The child is clearly a child.
Yeah.
And a 30-year-old man has all the responsibility in doing this. And we should also mention that grooming is always involved, or like very commonly involved in child sexual abuse. Again, going back to the fact that adult brains and child brains are not equally developed, the adult recognizes that they have to kind of lure the child in slowly. The child has to first gain the trust of the adult. And then once the adult realizes that the trust has been gained by the child, that's when they, start doing more serious acts against the child. And like this one, the child probably didn't even recognize that this was wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, like, they're supposed to trust this adult, and they are, like, groomed to trust this adult. So again, it's very, very exploitive of the child and very wrong. Not only is it immoral, but it's just, like you said, it's very disgusting.
Yeah, it's really,
and no child
really
should
sad.
have to go through that at all.
Yeah, I just think it's important to touch on the fact that in this case study, the adult perpetrator invited the 7-year-old to his house frequently for afternoon snacks. And then after the snack, that's when he perpetuates his abuse.
Yes.
So also, another important aspect that plays in here is that children are taught to trust adults. Children are taught to trust adults. That's what that's who they're learning from their whole life. Is they're being raised by a community of adults.
Yeah.
And it's just really sad to think that someone would take advantage of someone so innocent.
Right. And you're always taught stranger danger, to fear those that are strangers, to fear those adults that you don't know personally. But
statistics show that that's just not who's
it's
perpetrating sexual abuse.
Exactly. You're more likely to be a victim of any crime by someone you know.
Yeah.
Than a complete stranger. That's just a myth that has been a criminal myth that has been engraved in society and that thus everyone else's heads.
Yeah, it's really sad for the children,
Absolutely.
especially of this country, who are taught to fear strangers, but not to have advocacy for themselves. They aren't taught, like I said, they're not taught about non-contact behaviors. They're only taught about contact behaviors of abuse.
Yes.
So I guess the message from our podcast to you is, if you have children in the future, to teach them about contact and non-contact forms of abuse. I mean, I know we talked about this when we were writing our script, but what children are frequently taught is don't touch my no-no square, that type of training that they'll offer in schools, and that doesn't cover non-contact forms of abuse, like someone taking pictures of you.
Yes.
So we're going to move on to the next case study here, which is Manuel and Maria frequently walked around nude at home in front of their 5-year-old son. So I wanted to ask the audience, would you consider this child sexual abuse? And the point here is what constitutes sexual abuse can vary from culture to culture and from child to child. So in a child who grows up having a negative view of their childhood or a negative view of this act, this could be traumatic for them. If the child grows up with a healthy relationship to nudity because of what their parents decided to do, then that's awesome. Then that means this wasn't traumatic, but you never know.
Yeah.
And it's, up to the child. It's really the child's discretion. Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
you never know how
exactly
it might impact them in the future.
Yeah. Can vary from individual to individual.
Exactly. Yeah. Our final case study is Sally, who at 16 was a self-proclaimed nymphomaniac. She had sexual relationships with numerous boyfriends from school. One night, her 45-year-old stepfather asked if she wanted to mess around. She willingly agreed to sexual intercourse with him. So this one was included to highlight the importance of age gap and power dynamics when it comes to sexual abuse. So Sally was with a trusted adult. Sally was with an adult who was a paternal figure in her life, who was an authority figure in her life. Even though she's 16, she's not legally reached the age of consent. Her prefrontal cortex is not developed. She's not the best at making decisions, just based on the fact that she's a teenager. We've all been teenagers. We all know teenagers don't make the best decisions. So 100% the responsibility of this situation and the fault lies on the perpetrator, on the stepfather. It doesn't matter if she is a self-proclaimed nymphomaniac or if she's hypersexual or if she defines herself that way. Even the stepfather engaging her in any type of sexual act is just wrong.
Absolutely.
There's just such a power dynamic here. Him being so much older than her, and the age gap. She's not an adult, and
taking advantage of the fact that he realizes that she's probably hypersexual.
Yeah.
We should also mention hypersexuality could be an impact of earlier experiences of child sexual abuse.
Yeah.
You have registered that, or individuals could have registered that as acceptable. But also mention that the fact that Sally was displaying hypersexual behaviors could also infer that she could have had previous experiences of child sexual abuse. And again, this coming back up later in her life, where she was taken advantage of by an adult, and she was very vulnerable to him. And again, it's completely on the responsibility of her stepfather, and her stepfather really shouldn't have done that because he has a responsibility to protect and care for anyone underage.
This is just to stress that it's never the victim's responsibility or the victim's fault.
Yes.
It's always on the adult's shoulders to behave appropriately with children. I mean, come on. This is just not something that she should ever be blamed for. And I just have this bad feeling that with our legal system, if she were to report this, I just feel that people would point to her hypersexuality.
Yes.
And it's just a really unfortunate situation.
I think people are also very uneducated about how these problems could affect people, how these behaviors could show up, and how any of these experiences could really come up again in people's lives and impact them further.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about some of those impacts, Danny?
Yes. So I was going to start with some common effects, some common physical effects associated with child physical abuse. One of them is adolescent pregnancy and somatization. Back to adolescent pregnancy, And going back to Sally's case of being hypersexual, this could ultimately be an effect of experiencing child sexual abuse early in life and therefore developing hypersexual behaviors that could have um, resulted in early pregnancy, thus adolescent pregnancy. And then the chronic buildup of stress leading to negative health outcomes, specifically the immune system, goes back to ACEs, because these experiences have the ability to impact your physiology and therefore your health, which could be very negative in general.
And don't even begin on the financial costs,
Yes.
especially in this country.
Yes. Everything costs money.
More ACEs equals more hospital visits, equals more ER visits, more ambulance rides. We all know how expensive that can be in this country.
Yes, exactly. Some common emotional effects were anger, depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. Low self-esteem can be contributed by the just the way that those experiences made you feel. Like, a lot of people experience low self-esteem because they begin to feel, like, I guess, uncomfortable in their body, and also uncomfortable with the fact that they allowed that to happen. But again, it's not the victim's fault. We will always emphasize that it is never the victim's fault. It's always going to fall on the adult.
Yep.
Some behavioral effects that we have listed are sexual behavior problems, aggression, self-harm, running away, substance abuse, and rule breaking. So sexual behavior problems could exist in many ways. Some people could either be hypersexual, like we mentioned with Sally, and people could also be hyposexual. It could either be heightened or decreased based on how those experiences are interpreted. And again, it varies from person to person.
Yeah. I mean, it just impacts the development of a healthy sexuality.
Yes, exactly. Self-harm could also tie back to how those experiences made you feel, and also with the aggression portion of it. I don't doubt that those experiences that someone experienced made them very upset. Like, why wouldn't it? Aggression could actually hold itself in your body, and then could therefore lead to worse problems, especially when it comes to other cognitive behaviors.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that with self-harm, this can be when someone is feeling a lot of pain inside, and they want to express that pain, or they want a distraction from the emotional pain, and so they may harm themselves. This is the psych major of me creeping out into the podcast,
Yes.
but self-harm is really common in a lot of personality disorders, especially borderline personality disorder. So self-harm is definitely attributed to severe emotional pain and emotional suffering, which of course goes hand in hand with child sexual abuse, because it's really hard to cope with these types of things. So no shame whatsoever, but these are just some of the things that we tend to see, especially in adolescents or children.
Yeah. And beginning with substance abuse, trying things early on, or at a very young age.
Yep, experimenting with
Yes.
substances.
And therefore going into rule breaking or deviance.
Delinquency. A lot of juvenile delinquents with
Yes.
long histories of trauma.
Some cognitive effects associated with child sexual abuse could be displayed as negative self-attributions, as we have mentioned, with low self-esteem and self-harm. There's also dissociation, suicidal thoughts, academic problems, and cognitive distortions. Some interpersonal effects include relationship problems, I think this can also be elaborated on because this also, again, can vary from person to person.
Yep.
It can teach you how to have either, what was it? I remember, like, in class you were talking about, like, a clingy, like, attachment style, like...
Oh, yeah, like,
yes.
attachment styles, insecure, secure, avoidant,
Yes.
dismissive,
Yes.
disorganized. I would definitely say trauma is consistent with a disorganized attachment style, which means you don't really form an attachment to the caregiver because the caregiver has never really been there for you or taken care of your needs. Disorganized attachment styles can lead to all types of attachment issues down the road if they're formed early in your childhood.
Yeah, like, I was gonna say, I think, like, some had more to do with, like, neglect, but still, like, trauma in general, like, you're going to have some sort of attachment disorder. So for the psychiatric disorders that could actually come about, we have here listed PTSD, ADHD, and ADD disorders, which I really want to get into after this.
Yes, ma'am.
Eating disorders, borderline personality disorder, major depressive disorder, and substance use disorders. So on the topic of ADHD and ADD disorders, Dr. Burke Harris actually did touch on ADHD and ADD diagnosis. Those are very, very commonly associated with ACEs. And just thinking about how many people, like, I know, or, like, as, like, a population in America, like, how many people are actually diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, that is very serious.
Yes.
And also going back to the point of this being a public health issue, if we're prescribing so many kids, and we're not even just talking teenagers, but people are being prescribed... Children are being prescribed ADD and ADHD medication at such early ages that they are dependent on it through the rest of their lives. But that's really just an underlying issue caused by ACEs.
Yep.
And again, there needs to be screening for these things so that we can prevent these things from happening, or
stimulant addiction.
Yes. And possibly lessen the effects of some of these adverse childhood experiences that could therefore limit health risks and that could therefore limit public health crises within the leading causes of diseases.
That is so real.
And deaths. Yeah.
That is so real. And also, I personally not a huge fan of children being prescribed amphetamines for ADHD. I understand that it's completely necessary for some children. I'm obviously not a psychiatrist. I'm simply an undergrad. I'm simply an undergrad psych major, but this is in my humble opinion. I think that we need to tackle ADHD with a combination of therapy and medication. We can't just treat symptoms, with medication. We want to be looking for underlying causes. So
exactly.
I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and ACEs definitely do help with that. Like, they will help get to the roots.
Yes.
If you're getting asked about your adverse childhood experiences, then they'll correlate that with, yes, this is why this could be happening, Like,
it's also a cycle if you think about it. Like, a kid acts out. They've had some type of trauma or some type of adverse experience in their childhood, so they act out, so they get put on medication.
Yeah.
Or they act out, and so they get labeled as this type of kid, which causes them to have more adverse childhood experiences, which causes them to act out more, and it can be like a cycle.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think that's really important. Thank you, Danny.
Of course. I just wish people could be educated. Of course we're helping with this now. Like,
Right.
I hope this makes it just beyond, like, LeMoyne. I hope, like, people listen to this and, like, I don't know, I guess, like, realize, they're right. They should implement ACE screening across America in all types of offices, schools. I just really want people to be educated about how these things can affect you, because a lot of people probably just needed an ACE screening to help treat them.
They just needed to unpack.
Yes.
They needed to unpack.
And
what's
even
been
that's
going on with them.
stigmatized.
Yes.
Even that's stigmatized.
So sad.
Yeah. It's just such a shame.
And it's really hard for people to even take a look at their past because they're ashamed, or they feel that something that happened is their fault, or and this isn't even their fault. They feel that people are going to label them a certain way for what's happened to them in their past.
Yeah.
But you cannot control what the adults in your life happen, like the situation that the adults in your life happen to put you in when you were a child. Obviously, you have no control over that, yet that's still somehow your fault and still somehow stigmatized.
Exactly. And it's
really sad.
the term parents patriae, is that what it is?
Yes.
Or
Parents patriae, something.
Yeah, something like that. That's super important. And I know that's more so like the law to
The
help.
state has a right to
protect those that can't
its
protect
children.
themselves. Yeah, like, again, children, it's never the child's fault. Child has no action, no anything towards any of these experiences that have been done to them.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it was something that was done to you. It's nothing you can ever take responsibility for, or, well, if I had done this differently or this differently, this wouldn't have happened. No.
Right.
This is on the hands of the adults that you were around as a child. So now that we've talked about some of the shorter term consequences, why don't we move into long term consequences?
Yes.
For child sexual abuse. These tend to extend into adulthood. So a lot of them are similar. So why don't I start with physical like you did? So adults with a history of child sexual abuse may have chronic pain, gastrointestinal disorders, obesity, sleep disturbances, seizures, gynecological disorders, and then again the somatization. Somatization. I think that's how
Hopefully
you say it.
that's correct.
Yeah. So I think that the most interesting on this list would be seizures. That is crazy to me. Seizures being on this list of physical outcomes for child sexual abuse. And it just makes me think about the brain. But I'm going to talk about brain and memories in a little bit when I talk about PTSD. So after physical, you touch on emotional. So let's look at the emotional long-term consequences. We have anxiety, depression, anger / irritability, and poor self-esteem. So I think this goes back to what you were saying about how, you know, there's a lot of self-blame and person blame. Like, oh, this is my fault, and that can lead you to viewing yourself negatively, or having, like, these cognitive distortions of, like, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm guilty, I'm shameful. And I didn't even plan on for us to get into this, but I think this also has a lot to do with the Christian country that we live in.
Yes.
That people find and view sex as this private, secretive, shameful thing, sinful, if you will.
Yes.
Not something that can be openly discussed. And I think that plays into the shame that survivors have a lot more than people want to admit.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's just my opinion. And then you had behavioral, so let's see, behavioral long-term. We had substance abuse, suicidal behavior, self-harm, sexual dysfunction, sexual aggression, and risky sexual behavior. So obviously as you age out of childhood, there's going to be more sexual, like, problems.
Yes. Just
because you're engaging in sexual activity more, and probably, hopefully more healthfully than when it was perpetrated onto you as a child. But yeah, definitely substance abuse, suicidal behavior, and self-harm all tie in with these psychiatric disorders, which are long-term consequences as well. So some of those are PTSD, BPD, mood disorders, and substance use disorders / anxiety disorders. And then when it comes to PTSD, this one's huge for me because in less than 50% of people who experience a traumatic event, PTSD develops. So PTSD isn't 100%, oh, if something traumatic happens to you, you're gonna have PTSD. Not that, like, solid or not that, like, for sure of a thing that's gonna happen to you. So the fact that this is number one in psychiatric disorders for people who have child sexual abuse, it's just really upsetting to see. Very upsetting to see. And I also want to touch on the fact that our brains, each time that we have a new memory, or each time that we learn something new, the structure of our brain changes. Obviously, it's like a tiny, barely measurable change, like, what would you call it, molecular level,
okay,
right?
Yeah.
Super tiny change. But it's still happening, right? And if you had reoccurrent abuse that took place over, like, an extended period of time, imagine how those tiny changes could add up, you know? Imagine how especially if you're a child and your brain is in that very plastic stage where you still have synapses being formed, you still have synapses being pruned, you have connections like being developed. Imagine how many tiny little changes could happen and how that might impact your developing brain.
Yeah, that's so insane to me.
Like, it's really upsetting just to think about. But yeah, that's my piece on PTSD and memories. I just wanted to talk about memories really quick and how they actually do impact the structure and function of our brain. Cognitive problems extending into adulthood are suicidal ideation, dissociation, cognitive distortions, and I added academic problems again for young adults because if you're at that college age, you could still suffer from academic, like issues with academics.
Yes.
But I think the biggest one here is dissociation and cognitive distortions. Dissociation is huge because I'm going to talk about something real quick called dissociative identity disorder. Dissociative identity disorder is when the brain splits into multiple personalities. It was previously called multiple personality disorder. I don't know if it was actually ever technically called that, but like that's what everybody calls it. It's multiple personality disorder. Right. But DID is very serious and, interestingly, is usually stemming from child sexual abuse.
Wow.
Because the brain kind of splits off once the child's brain can't handle the amount of trauma that they're taking in, and so they'll kind of develop a protector to take over for them or to front in their brain so that they can kind of keep those memories with a separate personality. And that's how DID actually develops from a recurrent trauma. So DID and all other types of psychiatric disorders, but dissociation, yeah, huge problem. It can really, really impact your life. It can really impact your quality of life. If you're just feeling foggy, spaced out, like you're not in your body. It can also be amnesia problems.
I had no idea.
Forgetfulness, all types of things. But yeah, that's what multiple personality disorder is dissociative identity. It's a dissociation disorder.
I'm learning things.
But I think that's all we had for long-term consequences. If you want to get into resources.
Yes. So we have listed a bunch of resources based on specific consequences or effects. And I wanted to start with the physical symptoms. So we have on-campus resources, and we listed the MOYNE Wellness Center, and they can be reached at 315-445-4440.
The phone number will also be on your screen.
Yes, we will list all these resources. On the other hand, if you don't want to stay on campus for any resources, which I understand completely, we have listed a variety of off-campus resources. First being Syracuse Urgent Care. They can be reached at 315-401-3204. We have listed the DeWitt Urgent Care. It can be reached at 315-937-2007. Another one we have listed is Syracuse Planned Parenthood. They can be reached at 866-600-6886. We have listed the Vera House Incorporated. They can be reached at 315-468-3260, and they are located at 723 James Street in Syracuse, New York, 13210, I believe is the zip code. And you can also visit their website, www.verahouse.org. Another resource we have listed is the Upstate Women's Health Services, and they can be reached at 315-464-5210. We have listed McMahon Ryan Child Advocacy Center, and they can be reached at 315-701-2985. They are located at 601 East Genesee Street, Syracuse, New York, 13210. And their website is www.mcmahonryan.org. Another is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They can be reached at 800-799-7233. Excuse me. And the final is YWCA Women's Residence Program.
YWCA.
YWCA Women's Health Residence Program. They can be reached at 315-471-9480.
And that's just another shelter we included.
Yes. For emotional symptoms, we have included the on-campus resource, and that was the LeMoyne Wellness Center, but this is for counseling. So their email is counseling@lemoyne.edu, and they can be reached at 315-445-4195. So an off-campus resource is Helio Healthcare, also known as the Meadows Integrated Outpatient Clinic, and they can be reached at 315-471-1564, and they are located at 329 North Salina Street, Syracuse, New York, 13202, and they have 24/7 crisis support. Another is the National Graduate Student Crisis Line at 1-800-472-3457. We have listed domestic violence and sexual assault resources. One of them would be the Vera House at LeMoyne College, and they can be reached at 315-468-3260.
That's an on-campus resource.
Yes.
Just so everybody knows.
Yes. And we have also listed the Domestic Violence Hotline, and they can be reached at 1-800-799-7233. And you can also text the number 88788 and text in the chat START in all capital to talk to someone via message.
And that's anonymous as well.
Yes.
That's anonymous if anybody's looking for an anonymity. We also have 3 resources for psychiatric outcomes. We have Upstate Hospital, which is located at 750 East Adams Street, Syracuse, New York, 13210, and they can be reached at 315-464-5611. We have CPEP at St. Joe's Hospital, CPEP at St. Joe's Hospital, and the address is 310 Prospect Ave, Syracuse, New York, 13203. They can also be reached at 315-448-6555. They have 24/7 mental health intake in person, and they also have telehealth, which is like a Zoom call. We also have Liberty Resources Behavioral Health Crisis Services, which is available 24/7 to assist children and adults experiencing a mental health or substance use crisis. They can be reached at 315-251-0800.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope this served to educate people, I guess bring awareness as well, a lot of awareness to the stigma of child sexual abuse.
The shame.
Yeah, and again, emphasizing that it is never the victim's fault. With that, I hope you could take something away from this talk, educate others, share this, urge ACE screening to be implemented.
Yes.
At your school.
Take
your
the test
office, your
yourself.
clinic. Yes, take the test yourself.
We'll drop the link in bio.
Yes.
We'll drop the link in bio if anybody wants to take. I know I made a bunch of people take it after that class. I was like, hey, what's your ACE score? Want to find out?
And how does that make you feel?
Right.
How do you feel about that?
Do you think that's correlating?
Yes.
Anything?
And if so, I hope these resources can be a help to anyone that does need them.
Yes, please, guys.
Yes.
Take advantage of these resources. We included ones that are anonymous, ones that are on campus, off campus, whatever is going to suit your needs. There are people out there who care. There are people out there who want to help.
Yes.
This community is here to support you, and we're all going to work together to try and break the stigma, try to lower that age of disclosure, and hopefully bring more awareness and a lot less shame to these issues.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Bye.